Howdy, howdy, and welcome back to Gale FFTCG. I'm Serah, your host, and today we're looking at the Water Spellbook. This list has been around for a while, actually, but Opus 16, Emissaries of Light, has given us some really strong cards in the form of Tidus and Lightning, and it means that these kind of slimmer forward, heavy summon decks can do quite a bit with only a few forwards. So I took this to the Preston Regional. It was best of 5 for Swiss. I didn't make top cut, unfortunately. However, this list performed really well, even though I'd only built it the night before. It had a great showing, especially against the more aggressive decks like Soirees. Final Fantasy VII absolutely destroyed me, but the game still could have gone either way, I think. I need to test that matchup a little bit more, but we're not always here for meta. We're here to enjoy the game and have some fun. So with that being said, let's just dive straight into it. First of all, the strategy is simple. We want to put our opponent on a clock to deal with Tidus, so if we can get Tidus turn 1, we're basically off to the races. The best way to do that is Sildra, and I'll get onto that in a little bit. But we wanted to play turn 1 Tidus and just start attacking our opponent. Our opponent has to answer that, and if they do, Tidus goes to the bottom of the deck, we draw a card, and then we can remove one of their forwards too, which is really strong. We want to counter any early game aggression. Soirees is still a deck to consider. While I don't think it's as powerful as my initial assessment of the deck, I think it's important that we counter it. The best cards to do that are with Serah and Mashery. Tidus can also counter it because your opponent has to play into it, but we also run Lightning for that sort of thing, and I'll go into those a little bit later as well. And we want to win through superior card advantage, which Mog 6 generates. We've got some Moogles and some other cards that do the same thing. So yeah, that is the basic overview. In our synergy slots here, we have Mashery and Serah. They're very strong index with lots of summons. Serah, in particular, when it enters the field, we reveal the summons, or as many summons in our hand as we want. Oftentimes, I will choose to only reveal like 1 or 2 summons, so my opponent still has the factor or to consider that I may have more in hand. It's a little cute way to bluff. But when we do, we can dull and freeze any amount of characters that is equal to the number of summons we've shown. So that's really strong, especially against Soirees, where you play them down the turn that they come in, and because they don't have haste, you can kind of just dull freeze them and give yourself an extra turn to do stuff, which is something that Soirees preys upon, decks that can't respond very well. This deck is one of those kind of decks that even if you go second, you can play Serah early and you'll be able to still survive for quite a while just because of Serah's flexibility. The other thing to know about Serah is you can, basically, whenever you cast a summon, you can dull or freeze a forward and dull or freeze a backup. So you can kind of keep your opponent off of plays or force them to do early game plays. Like you can go, okay, I want to dull your Althea so you can't do anything with it. And they go, okay, I want to bounce this thing back to my hand. So by doing that, you've removed 2 cards from the field and basically got Serah's thing for free, as well as casting a summon, so you could cast Moogle or something like that, and it would be really strong. Because even though Moogle just doesn't do anything really proactively, Serah turns that into a proactive play, which is really cool. We also have Serah that searches for Mashery, which is really important in this deck, and 2 CP Mute. It is a Prince. Oftentimes, I don't care about playing the Mute, but it can be helpful to just have a search target, so I can play like my Knights or my Gastelian Emperor Cid. This deck really works well off of 2 backups because the deck is reducing a lot of the cost of summons anyway. Having 2 means you can play any forward basically for paying 1 CP and a card. The highest CP cost is only 4 in this deck, so the deck is quite cheap, and 2 backups is kind of roughly where we want to be at. We're only running 13, so Serah is kind of important to get us those 2 colors. We definitely need them. In card advantage, Mastery draws us lots of cards. Tidus draws us lots of cards and removes threats. And Mog 6 draws us cards and removes threats. To help Mog 6 go off, we're running Moogles, which is just 1 CP, EX Burst, draw 2, and then discard 1. Very strong. The other card we're running to supplement this, old versions of the deck used to run Poo Poo, which is basically Moogle, but you discard a card and draw 2 instead. We're running 3 CP Leviathan EX, which lets us check the top, or lets us draw 2 and then put 1 back on top. So we can put our EX bursts and we can kind of set the top of our deck to be to kind of be whatever we want it to be. We can put him on the bottom as well, so we can maybe just tuck away a card we don't necessarily want to up our count for EX bursts. But I would recommend usually just taking an EX burst in your hand, maybe a card that would seem otherwise dead, and just put it back on top. This works specifically well with Remora, but the cool thing is it triggers Mog 6, which if you draw 4 or more, you bounce a card back to hand. And if you draw 6 or more, you just break something straight away with the Mog. And so that's really strong. If you're playing against any Mog deck and maybe somebody's playing against you with this list and you want to counterpick them, destroy the Mog, because if the Mog isn't destroyed, the trigger will happen. If the Mog isn't on the field at the time of the trigger, that doesn't happen and you don't lose a forward. So that's really important to know. For our removal, we have Lightning, which beats Go Wide decks, which there are a crazy amount of these cards running around just now. You have FF7, you have Soirees, you have Wind decks, especially with Chocobo and that sort of thing. There's a lot of decks running around right now, and Lightning does a good job of countering those. We're only running 1 because really our summons are doing a lot of the work anyway. A lot of them being EX bursts means we can, with the Leviathan, rig the top card and then remove something, and our opponent can't respond to that, so we only really need 1 in this list. Atomos gets around the can't be broken clause of Soirees and things, and on top of that, it gets around Tidus. So if Mono Water is a big deck at the time of recording this video, and one of the best ways to beat it, this deck is kind of based upon that concept, because your opponent wants to play a turn 1 Tidus and just start swinging at in this, and so basically you want to be able to remove their Tidus early. So my opponent plays down Tidus turn 1. If I have Atomos in my hand, I just win that game because I start forcing them to play on my terms, and a lot of these aggressive decks don't want that. They want you to, go out of your way to, destroy Tidus so they get card advantage, etc., etc. We don't want our opponents to do that, so we just are playing Atomos to remove those sort of things. Remora is a really strong EX burst. There are times where that will save you. Tidus cannot respond to EX burst, so that's really important to know. And because of that, the 3 CP Leviathan putting Remora on top becomes even more clutch. You can obviously do that with 6 CP Leviathan and bounce something to hand. You can even use Kukulane to turn off its abilities, which is really strong, actually, especially if you have maybe a follow-up removal piece. But you could cast Remora for cheaper, but you don't have a way of doing that until Tidus's abilities are off. Really, this deck is really centralized around the idea that Tidus is one of the stronger forwards in the game, and right now that Mono Water is really, really strong. Again, for removal, Mog and Tidus both remove threats. If Tidus is targeted, he goes on the bottom, puts one of your opponent's ones on the bottom, and you draw 3. It's really strong right away. And then Mog, obviously, we've talked about already, draws cards and removes threats for that. Really strong card. Both of these are cards your opponent has to respect, because if they don't, the deck just kind of starts to run away from them, and they'll be on a clock. And last but certainly not least, protection. So Leviathan, 2 CP, protects us from fire decks, especially ones running Brynhildr, etc. And it can be a combat trick too, where we go, I'm going to go to combat, swing, and they're like, okay, cool, I'm going to block. And then you're like, well, I'm going to cast Leviathan, so the damage is lessened, I'll draw a card, whatever. You can bluff your opponent out of this, maybe your opponent is playing fire. There's a lot of cool things you can do with that Leviathan, and even when you see it in damage, it often is enough to stop combat phase entirely, because your opponent's like, well, I don't want to swing into a Gao that gives me extra stuff, or like that now doesn't take damage. These are really cool things to know about these like sort of cards that don't seem as good. Obviously, anything that you cast means Terra gets to go ahead and dull something. That's really strong as well. Mashery can bounce our own cards to protect them, which is very, very strong. Mashery, I'm going to take a second here to talk about Mashery in what it means for the format right now. Right now, arguably, some of the strongest decks, well, no, not even arguably, some of the strongest decks in the format right now are running Mashery. Mono Water, there's some fire decks running around as well with Mashery. The card is great. I can't refute that it's not strong. I actually really love the card. I think it's a fantastic design space. Unfortunately, it means that as long as Mashery is out, there are unfair plays that can be made. A lot of the people I've been talking to in the competitive scene, and even not in the competitive scene, are getting a bit tired of Mashery and how insanely good it is. And I think I used to think, oh, it won't come up. It won't stay on the watch list forever. They'll take it off. They won't ban it. But I can see more and more people calling for its ban, and I can see why. Anytime I had this in Preston, and even during Doga Sophie and all these other sort of eras, the game just felt over as soon as you had like 2 or 3 shots with Mashery, and if you had more than that, you had the game won. And so I think it's important that, to look at it and say, yes, this card is broken, yes, this card is super strong, and yes, there needs to be something done about it. I hate saying that because I think the card is really cool. It encourages a really cool style of deck building, but I also think there needs to be the deck needs some help, or like the game needs help, and I think part of that is removing Mashery entirely. It might slow down the game. It might make it a little more fair overall. But yes, it is still a very powerful card, and it is a lot of our protection racket. It's also a lot of our removal. Like you can bounce things, and that's how you win the game, because you can just swing out. There's a lot of cool things that can do. So obviously Mashery is good. How long it will remain in the game, I'm not sure. But it's still here now, so this list is still so much the better for it. And last but certainly not least, Kukulane turns off any and all abilities, especially if it's EX bursts. I've talked about it a little bit. We stop Tidus, but it also draws us a card. Half of the way we win this game, especially with this deck, is just by drawing cards. We'll have so many more answers than our opponent will, even if we're not necessarily doing well. Another cool thing, Mashery is, in this list, Mashery is chronically easy to pull off. Say your opponent goes like, I'm going to go to attack phase. You don't have enough summons in your break, and you go, okay, I'm going to cast Moogle by discarding a summon. Then I'll draw 2, discard a summon, and then that resolves, and suddenly I have 3 summons in my bin, and we're off to the races. Mashery is chronically easy to pull off in this. I haven't been doing this in as many deck techs, but I think it's important to bring it back. There's a couple cards I haven't even remotely discussed because they're just obviously good or whatever, but just for the sake of people just arriving in the game or people who are new to the channel, there's some really important cards that I didn't mention in any of the sections, but Yuna, reducing costs, is super important. We're running 3 of it, that's why. Shantoto in Ice. Ice getting recursion is super important for this deck. So our opponent decides to remove for Mashery, we just play Shantoto, we get it back. Really strong. We are running 3 Ice Knights, so we can generate crystals. Atomos can be made cheaper by crystals. Shantoto can actually be used as like a hand trap with crystals. I didn't ever use it in Preston, but it was super cool as a concept. So yeah, definitely a thing worth remembering if you can do that. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in protection, but Kamari and putting a counter on Tidus means he is basically invulnerable to board wipes, which is really important in this type of list where Tidus is one of our heavy hitters in the deck. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh yeah, Celeste searches Locke, and Gastalian Empire Sid searches Terra, Celeste, and Gao. Oh, and Mog 6 as well. It searches like half the deck, so we're running one of that. Even though the backup count is slim, I feel like every single game I have backups, or I just put down Tidus turn 1 and start swinging, and my opponent doesn't care if I have backups because they're just trying to spend a bunch of stuff to get rid of Tidus. Either of these things are absolutely fine. But yeah, that is basically the whole list. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to hear your suggestion for some other deck build ideas. And I'm going to put out a video about Heroic and just kind of the state of the format, where everything's at. Obviously, the format, every time I talk about it, everyone goes, oh my gosh, soirees are going to take over the format. And I think in our next video, it will be time to introduce some restrictions upon said format. But since it's obviously like a community-based one, I'll talk with a few of the people who are more interested and influential in the heroic scene, and we'll have a look at that. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.